Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for the very first episode of Agentic Advantage, FIRtech's new webinar and podcast series focused on what's really happening in the world of agentic AI and enterprise automation. This series is about cutting through the hype and unpacking what's actually working inside real organizations across finance, insurance, SAP operations, fraud, and shared services. Today's session is called What the Uck Actually is Agentic AI, and we'll be going to breaking down what agentic AI really means, how it differs from traditional automation, and what businesses and technical teams need to understand before they're planning the next wave of transformation. Today, I'm joined by Fani Botha, COO at FIRtech, and someone who spent over 2 decades working across SAP, automation, and AI implementations for banks, insurers, and large enterprises. Fani leads FIRtech's work across intelligent automation, fraud AI, IDP, and large-scale transformation programs, and he's been deeply involved in building many of the agentic frameworks we'll be talking about today. Fani, great to have you on. Let's start at the beginning.
Thanks, Seb.
Fani, everyone is suddenly talking about agentic AI. Before we go anywhere near the hype, what actually is agentic AI in simple terms?
Okay, so I know that the question is, what actually is agentic AI? And I thought that we could dive right into that topic, but I did a snap poll just speaking to people the last few weeks, and I think it's just worthwhile to take a step back and just see how we got to this juncture that we actually now call agentic AI. So agentic AI is something that grew out of a family of technologies. A lot of the agentic platforms that are in existence today grew from traditional RPA providers. Now, RPA standing for robotic process automation. Some of the other agentic platforms grew out of IDP providers, IDP standing for intelligent document processing. And these technologies, RPA and IDP, are technologies that have been around for a while. They've grown to a very mature state. And together, these technologies have done great work in terms of back office automation. Automating tasks in systems, reading documents, populating the systems with those documents, and truly giving us some level of very, very impressive automation in the workplace. Now we get to agentic. Now, at its core, agentic AI is when systems stop just responding to prompts and start working towards goals. Traditional automation like RPA and IDP, they execute steps. Traditional AI gives answers. Agentic AI does something completely different. It perceives what's happening, reasons about it, plans what to do next, and then takes actions across systems. That shift from task execution to goal-driven behavior is what changes everything.
Yeah, and that shift you're describing from just executing steps to actually owning outcomes feels like the key distinction people miss. So I think we should try ground that a bit. Can you give me an example of something that is not agentic, but is oftenly incorrectly called agentic?
Absolutely. A good example is a chatbot plugged into a workflow. People often say that they onto an agentic solution, but we have to take a very fine distinction here in terms of when something is agentic and when it's just a use of a LLM. As an example, people using ChatGPT to help them generate emails. That's assistive AI. There's no planning. There's no ownership of outcomes. There's no real autonomy. If it can't decide what to do next or take responsibility for moving a process forward, it's not agentic.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important call out because a lot of what is being marketed as agentic is really just assistive. Why do you think agentic AI is such a big deal now? What changed recently?
Well, 3 things converged. First, language models became capable of reasoning instead of just generating text. If you look at the initial releases of, as an example, ChatGPT, they were at their core massive text predictors. So if you gave it a response saying hello, it went back to a statistical model and tried to predict what would be the most likely response that you would want to hear back from this LLM. Now, these models have got real reasoning capability, and that's key in agentic. Secondly, automation platforms have finally matured to the point where they can safely expose real systems. So an example of this is that you might have a accounting system in the background which has your customers' account balances. Now, you can't give all of your clients access to your accounting system to say, go and log in and see what your account balance is. But you can put an automation platform in between your accounting system and your clients. And through some kind of a web interface, through a chatbot, through any of these interfaces, a client can say to the chatbot, I want to see what my account balance is. The automation platform can go into your accounting system, go and fetch what the specific client's account balance is, and give them the answer. Thirdly, and this is really important, orchestration layers like UiPath's Maestro appeared. This means that you can finally coordinate AI, robots, APIs, and even people in a governed way. Agentic only works when all of these exist at the same time.
So it's not really just one breakthrough, it's that the pieces finally click together. And when they do, it unlocks things we just couldn't do before. So what problems were simply not solvable before this convergence?
Well, anything that required judgment across like very messy inputs. You know, when you look at, for example, fraud investigations. Now, the combination of RPA and IDP can go and read across different documents, and it can go into systems and it can look up stuff. But there's no real one recipe to do a fraud investigation. And that's where this judgment really comes in. So these things are classified as messy inputs because you simply don't know what you're going to be getting into the system. But those processes break traditional automations. Now, if systems can interpret, hypothesize, test, and adapt, this is when you have agentic AI, and this is when you can start solving these problems.
And those are exactly the kinds of processes most organizations struggle with, the messy, judgment-heavy ones. You've coined this term Unified Cognitive Kit, or UCK. What is it, and why do you feel the need to create that framework?
Absolutely. So it's actually not what the UCK is agentic AI, but it is the UCK, the Unified Cognitive Kit. Now, because most people think that agentic means ChatGPT with buttons, it doesn't. So this is where the Unified Cognitive Kit steps in. And this is our way of explaining and breaking down what actually sits inside agentic systems. It's the combined set of abilities: perception, reasoning, planning, action, and collaboration. When those five things come together, you don't get a chatbot with buttons, you get an operational system.
Yeah, and I like that you're framing its capabilities and not just the tools, because that already changes how people think about design. So can you walk us through the Unified Cognitive Kits at a high level?
Okay, sure. So obviously the Unified Cognitive Kit is very extensive in its nature and how we work with it in our client base. But at a high level, it's obviously these different dimensions that you essentially design and build for to essentially bring an agentic system together. So looking at these different aspects, perception is how the system reads documents, screens, transactions, events. So these might combine your traditional technologies like IDP, RPA, screen scraping, these kind of things, but it really gives your agentic solution eyes into the rest of the world. Reasoning is how it understands context and applies logic. You know, when you ask a reasoning model to think about decisions, but given the context that it's an auditor versus given the context that it's a sales agent, that will produce quite different results. And this is where the reasoning aspect is not as simple as it seems, but it's really critical to the agentic solution. Planning is how it decides what sequence of steps to follow. Action is essentially what it can do after it's reasoned, after it's planned. And so these actions is how it actually executes work across systems like SAP and CRM, your accounting system. So these would typically still use things like APIs, RPA, these kind of things. And then critically, collaboration is how multiple agents or how agents and humans work together with guardrails. It's essentially building your digital organization of agents so that they can work together with the humans. If any one of those is missing, you don't have agentic.
Yeah, and what really stands out, if one of those aren't there, you don't lose the system, but you do lose autonomy. So if a company only has one or two of those components, what does that look like in practice?
They have brittle solutions. Simply put, they've got very brittle solutions. You know, so if there's OCR without reasoning, you might be able to extract all of the information that you needed to solve a problem, but the physical agent won't know how to put together those pieces or reinterpret it to understand that the solution can actually be solved. Bots without context, chatbots without action. That can just give you a summary, or it can give you a very, very impressive rundown, but it can't go and action the outcome of solving this problem. These things feel impressive in demos, but they end up collapsing in production. And the UCK exposes exactly why.
So then which parts of the unified cognitive kit do most organizations underestimate?
I would say the planning part. So everyone focuses on perception and models because that tends to come from like these technologies that we spoke about previously. It's very easy to give your system eyes into the system that it might be working on, like your accounting system. It's very easy to even ingest documents. It's easy to bring in the language component so that it can actually sound impressive when it talks back to you. But the planning component, I think, is missing. So very few invest in this decision sequencing. You know, things like recovery strategies, exception paths. That's where autonomy actually lives.
And then for the execs listening, where does this show up in the real world? And what changes when companies adopt agentic AI?
I would say the biggest shift is that processes stop being flowcharts and they start behaving like digital employees. You know, we always try to create this process flow or a flow chart of the ideal scenario within a business. And that's where you'd be convinced that you can automate almost everything in a business with something like robotic process automation. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. And if you have a quick interview with an employee that's been in real life, they'll tell you things don't happen exactly like they were put on the flowchart. So instead of scripting every scenario, you define outcomes and you define constraints and escalation rules, exactly like you do in your business. Then the system figures out how to get there. That's why you suddenly see things like, you know, fraud investigations, kind of taking different approaches, pulling in additional documents, using very human-like approaches to solve things. Financial reconciliations. You know, if the invoice and the statement have got different descriptions, but it's clearly the same product, an agentic system can resolve that, whereas a traditional deterministic system won't be able to.
Yeah, and I think digital employees is a powerful way to put it. It's a completely different mental model to traditional automation. So if I'm a COO or a CFO listening, how do I recognize whether my organization is even ready for this?
Right. So if you already run some form of platform in your organization, whether that's a workflow platform, whether that's an RPA platform, an IDP platform, you're a lot closer than you think. Readiness for agentic isn't about AI maturity. It's about process clarity. It's about data access. And then critically, it's about operational governance.
So then readiness is more operational than technological, which I think will surprise a lot of leaders. And for the UiPath and automation specialists, what's actually different architecturally?
Well, I think this is a very difficult one. It sounds simple, but it's a paradigm shift because you move away from a bot-centric design to an orchestration-centric design. Platforms like UiPath are evolving from robot runners into agent platforms. You are now suddenly combining IDP, AI models, business rules, traditional robots, APIs, and these new Maestro-style orchestrations into a cognitive layer. Essentially, you are building a new digital organization. Your job becomes designing capabilities, not scripts.
Yeah, it's actually a complete new way of thinking about it, from building bots to designing cognitive capabilities. And then how does unified cognitive kit change how architects should approach solution design?
Well, you design for cognition, not for control. So every solution should explicitly define how these five aspects, perception, reasoning, planning, action, and collaboration, are handled. They should be different parts of your project where you go and say, for perception, these are the systems that we are going to deal with, these are the documents. And so we make a perception part of the project that focuses on how do we access these systems, how do we navigate them, almost like you would train your employees to work across documents and across systems. For the reasoning component, you think about who are we dealing with? Is it an accountant? Is it a salesperson? Is it a fraud investigator? What is the context and what kind of reasoning should the agent that you're employing be able to have? The planning component is, again, something that you can't script out fully, but how do you plan the next logical action? And then the action component is obviously how is the system able to drive that action? Do they have access to the systems to go and file an invoice? Do they have access to an API to maybe pull additional data from another system to close a support ticket? And then finally, the collaboration part is really critical. How would these agents hand off work from one agent to the next? How would an agent escalate something to a human? How would they report as a group back to a human on how work is being handled? If you're missing one of these things, you don't ship to production.
And then, in your opinion, where does UiPath's Agentic stack and Maestro specifically fit into this unified cognitive kit idea?
Well, Maestro is effectively the nervous system. So it becomes almost the COO of your agentic solution. It coordinates like the perception services, the reasoning models, handles how the robots are allocated, behave themselves, and even how work is allocated to and executed by people. So UiPath's agent builders give you the perception and reasoning components. So the robot gives you the action, and then there's great workflow tools that gives you the ability to bring the human into the loop in terms of collaboration. So when you map the UiPath architecture to our UCK framework, you realize that they're building a full cognitive kit, not just better bots.
Well, when you map it that way, it's clear that UiPath is aiming much higher than just better automation. So in that case, what does Maestro give you that you can't reliably build yourself?
Well, enterprise grade orchestration. All of these buzzwords like BPMN, that's where it exists. State management, audit, which is critically important in this agentic world, observability and explainability. People are scared of AI for the wrong reasons. If you've got these components built into your enterprise platform, you know exactly and you can control exactly what your AI and your agents are doing. And then human in the loop. This is very critical because we are never, ever going to get rid of humans. Humans just become more critical to bring into the process at the right stage. And then finally, rollback strategies. Now, you can prototype agentic, but you cannot industrialize it without this level of orchestration.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between something experimental and something you can actually scale. And then a lot of leaders worry about agentic AI sounding risky with systems acting on their own. Where are the real boundaries?
Well, true agentic AI in the enterprise is never uncontrolled. So guardrails are really, really important. And guardrails are part of this unified cognitive kit. If you think about it, then you're never afraid that your employees are going to start acting as rogue agents all at once. And the reason for that is because you've got a set of internal controls. You've got approval thresholds, you've got segregation of duty, you've got audit trails, and the guardrails within Agentic is exactly the same. So it's really important to understand how to implement these things like confidence scoring, human checkpoints, and orchestrated permissions to your Agentic solution so that it stops being like this Silicon Valley demo and starts being a truly realizable solution. Autonomy always lives inside of governance.
So autonomy really doesn't mean absence of control. It means better control built in from the start. So do you think there's a danger that companies move too fast?
Yes. Yes, I think the danger is in skipping orchestration and governance. It's very, very tempting to move quickly through these stages, but that's how you get demos instead of systems.
Yeah, that's a really important warning. Speed without structure just creates chaos. What governance controls would you insist on before anything goes agentic?
I think for me, there's at least three minimums. So, full auditability, explicit action permissions, and confidence-based escalation. The auditability component is built into these platforms, but it's really also how the person that's implementing this enables it. And you should really have the guardrails, the internal controls, both the internal auditor as well as the external auditor in mind when doing these things. In terms of explicit action permissions, so systems give us this level of role, authority, segregation of duty, but it's very easy for someone trying to get access to a system with automation to say, just give me all of those permissions or give me the highest number of available privileges across this group of users. Whereas you need to go and understand why those permissions were set up in the first place. And if you're able to mimic how the team was set up with agents, then you live within those guardrails. Confidence-based escalation, we do it in our businesses today, right? So someone would realize that if something falls below a certain level of confidence of them being able to solve it, they would run to their manager. And this is exactly what you need your agentic solution to do. If you can't answer who authorized what, why it happened, and what happened when, it's wrong. You're not ready.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty clear checklist. If you can't tick those boxes, you really shouldn't be deploying. What is a good example of where unified cognitive kits is clearly visible in action?
There's many great ones, but I always feel like a very tangible one is where you look at fraud investigations engines. I think it's a perfect example. You never know what kind of information you're going to get in. You never know what the kind of transaction or insurance claim or situation is going to be that you are going to be investigating. And this is where Agentic can perceive across transactions, across documents. So the perception bit is really, really important. Then it uses reasoning to reason across patterns. Not all criminals try and go for the same modality. So it needs to reason what is actually happening here. Then it can plan how to actually perform this investigation based on the patterns that it identified. Which other pieces of information does it need to focus on? Which red flags really stand out? Which additional fields from a system does it need to pull? Then, importantly, it can trigger actions. So it can, for example, immediately block an account, send an urgent alert to a manager, or even appoint an external investigator if that's required. And critically, it collaborates with humans all the while And that is UCK in the wild.
Yeah, and I think that example makes the framework very real. You can actually see each cognitive layer at work. So how does this change companies should approach automation programs?
Start building automations. So start building automations and start building capabilities instead. Rather than this bot posts invoices, the conversation should become this cognitive system resolves invoices and queries. That changes how you design teams, how you design governance, how you set up KPIs, and even how you perform basic functions like procurement.
And that shift from tasks to outcomes has a massive implication beyond just technology. So then what mistakes are you seeing companies make today with agentic AI?
Yeah. Well, treating it like a tool instead of a system. Back to the start of our conversation, people that just drop an LLM into a process and calling it agentic. Some of these software vendors make it very easy for you to click at the top left of your screen and create the agent, what it calls an agent, and then it's really just like bringing an LLM into a business process. And so without these other components that we mentioned, orchestration, memory of previous actions, audit, and these actions in systems, you don't have an agent. You have a very, very expensive autocomplete function.
And then maybe to provide some guidance, if someone wants to start their agentic journey in 2026, where should they realistically begin?
Well, I think it goes back to the traditional kind of funnel, how we would identify real good agentic opportunities. So it's still the high volume kind of transaction space. But now it's shifted to being the decision heavy processes, where we always stayed away from decision heavy processes. We now welcome that. Another good place to look out for is where there's existing automations in place. So whether that's workflow, whether that's a level of IDP, whether it's a level of APIs, those are ideal because the way that the agentic is going to action thing, the way that it's going to perceive things, those basic building blocks are in place. But even if those aren't there, that shouldn't stop you from taking this journey and starting down this road. Those environments that already have a level of perception and action just will be quicker because you just add reasoning and planning on top, but you shouldn't be steered away from trying it in any of your other high volume decision heavy processes.
So basically what you're saying is don't start greenfield. Start where the foundations already exist. So then how would you say the unified cognitive kit helps FIRtech clients specifically?
Many, many ways, but in a word, it gives them a language. So it creates this common language between the business analysts, between the developers, between the SMEs in a process, and between leadership. Once leadership understands this cognitive process with the cognitive pieces, you see the discussion shifting from should we use AI to which cognitive abilities is missing in this specific process. That's a much more powerful design conversation.
Yeah, and I think having that shared language is often the hardest part of transformation. So if we look ahead, what do you think most people are underestimating about agentic AI?
I think that it changes organizational design. When systems can reason and act, job roles, control frameworks, and operating models will shift. It's not just a text change, it's like a whole operating model change.
Yeah, I think it's a big statement. It's not just a new tech, it's a complete new operating model. If you had to summarize today's conversation in one message, what should the people listening walk away with?
Sure, big question. I would say agentic AI is not a product. We know that there's many platforms out there, and you have to go and make your own decision which of those platforms is the right fit for your organization. But Agentic is not a product, it's a capability stack. And so something like our unified cognitive kit is really a framework that is going to help you understand whether you've got all of those capabilities in the stack and whether you are actually building an agentic solution or building a fancy email autocomplete.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to land. Thanks, Vonnie.
Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thanks again for everyone taking the time to join us today. I hope the discussion gave you a clearer, more grounded understanding of what agentic AI really is, not just as hype or as a tool, but a capability stack that fundamentally shifts automation from task execution to outcome ownership. What I'd like to do now is open the floor up to a live Q&A, so you can take the chance to dig deeper, challenge the ideas explored today, and what agentic AI could realistically mean for your organization, your processes, and your operating models. So what I'll do is I'll just pop a text in the chat there in the Q&A section, and then you guys can go through with your questions that I'll propose to Fani.
Seems like everyone understands everything about agentic or nothing about agentic.
Okay, I see some questions coming through here. Carl Govender says, you spoke about planning being underestimated. What does planning actually look like in a live enterprise agent?
So this is a very, very big topic of discussion, and we'll definitely have a future episode specifically focusing on this. But I think it goes back to the context of the specific job role that you are emulating with this agent. Now, let's take the example of a accountant that's filing invoices, performing reconciliations, these kinds of back office functions. Often the planning function you can find in a manual, you can find in a standard operating procedure, if this, then that, etc. But interestingly, it's a very useful tool to have detailed interviews with employees in terms of how they actually deal with their jobs from a day-to-day basis. So it's not always clear which planning steps you need to put after each other. And also, planning is a definite long-term endeavor that you keep on refining and refining and refining. But it cannot be understated the importance of this planning component, and we will have a future episode on this.
Cool. And then Sanvia says, what role does orchestration like UiPath Maestro really play compared to just building agents directly?
Okay, so it's very difficult to experience the value of a good orchestration platform until you've experienced the lack thereof. Now, I want you to imagine that you're setting up an organization of 50 to 500 employees, And the only rule about this organization is that you are not allowed to check in on any employee whilst they are busy with tasks, and none of your employees are allowed to speak to any other employee whilst they are busy with tasks. Now, this sounds like this could be an okay outcome, but if you've got a bunch of agents running around trying to do things in your organization, you're going to get an unorchestrated mess because one agent might be trying to post an invoice and they're not allowed to orchestrate or check with another agent whether a GRV has been posted. One agent might be setting up a contract, but they can't have any idea of what previous dealings with this specific client has been or what other contracts are in place. And so orchestration, the value of that really cannot be overstated.
Caleb says, you mentioned that readiness is more about operations and technology. What is the first non-technical change organizations should make to prepare?
So I think that it is, for me, again, back to something like internal controls. You can say that your process mapping and the level of documentation needs to be at a certain level. But I think a review of your internal control framework, and if you've got really good job role definitions in your organization, is a very good starting point. And the reason for this is with agents, they can perform jobs at an extremely high level of accuracy, precision, etc. But it comes down to how well you can define those job roles for the different agents. It comes down to how well you can define the handover points between agents, which agents work in teams, which agents are makers, which agents are checkers. And so really a good review of how your organization is set up from an organizational and control perspective, I think is a good starting point.
Yeah, agreed. And then Zara says, in regulated industries like banking and insurance, what are the top two controls that must exist before going live?
So I think I just mentioned this now, but it's very important to have that maker checker kind of perspective. With technologies like these that we ultimately try to speed up business, that we try to scale, that we try to shift effort away from humans, we must not forget that a human checking function is a really, really critical function. So if you've had an organization where, for example, you've had a team of payment administrators which might have prepared payments, and then you had a manager that checked that payment, and you had a director that check payments above a certain level, you can't move to an agentic organization and say, my agents will take care of it all. We must really distinguish where the effort sits, where we are removing effort, and not remove really critical internal controls and that whole maker checker process.
Yeah, I think you've touched on this question as well. Yashay says, for the technical audience, how does solution design change when you design around UCK instead of workflows or unified cognitive kits instead of workflows?
Okay, great question. So again, I think there will be future discussions on this. We'll do some deep dives, some demos of agentic solutions running, where it goes right, where it goes wrong. We'll really get into the nuts and bolts of it. But if you take, for example, a workflow is at the end of the day a business process flow that's going to say we start here with system A, step 1, 2, 3 happens, and then we end up with system B. Now, what that workflow doesn't specify is that critical information, which is an input to this process, actually lives in documents which sit above and below this process flow diagram. But they were never documented because it happens 1 out of 10 times, or it happens on Wednesdays, or whatever the case is. So when you change that paradigm, when you start having a conversation with an employee as opposed to just a process flow, to understand what's the scope of all of the systems they consult, all of the people they speak to, all of the documents they check, you really get how the perception piece is a much more broader sense to design for than saying I'm emulating this process flow. And all of the other components of UCK work exactly the same. You've got a project stream for planning, you've got a project stream for reasoning, etc.
Very interesting. Sia says you use the phrase digital organization of agents. What new roles do humans actually play in that model?
I think very critical checking and coordinating and managerial roles. So there's a lot of hype and a lot of fear about this future where agents are going to be running around all over the internet, over our organizations. Agents are going to be replicating themselves, and it's just like madness. So people often ask, is there going to be a basic global income, and are we all going to just sit on our backsides and rewatch episodes of Love Island season 6? And I think that actually the opposite is going to happen. All of our jobs are going to become more meaningful, not less meaningful, because all of the parts of our jobs that are not engaging, that are repetitive, that are, in a sense, not human centric, we can hand off to agents. But the parts of the jobs that we will retain is coordinating those agents. As if all of us have got 1,000 new employees, we will still be left with the unsolvable problems that doesn't fit into the reasoning models. We will still be sitting with the exceptions, with the queries, and I think most importantly, with the human interactions.
We've got a good question from Sinclair. It's one people often ask about agentic systems. He says, how do you stop an agentic system from becoming unpredictable when it's allowed to reason and plan?
So again, I think a future topic for a lot of discussion. Um, Back to where we've come from with large language models or LLMs. In the beginning, especially, there was a lot of very evident hallucinations that happened with large language models. Even now, if you still use a non-enterprise grade large language model like the free GPT that you might be able to sign up for, you'll get a very sycophantic kind of behavior from those models. Now, two things: we use completely different enterprise grade models, and also these models are grounded in what we call context. So each model is essentially primed with a set of rules, instructions, and very specific context of what its job function is. Finally, we employ the maker checker perspective to say every output that comes from a model is then checked by essentially a little audit function. Now, all of those things are good and well, but then what happens in the end of the day if this thing absolutely goes nuts? Well, this is where your internal controls, your system permissions, all of the things that would have stopped a rogue employee from going nuts also need to step in. So it's really a mix of these traditional system controls with the stuff that we build into Agentic. But at the end of the day, it's not less safe than employing people.
Satenda says, you gave fraud as a strong example. Besides fraud, what other business areas are seeing the fastest agentic ROI?
So fraud is a lovely topic because it's very vast. It's something that people essentially thought that AI wouldn't be able to crack, and it's now making massive strides in that sense. But really, it's growing everywhere where you see massive transaction volumes across your entire value chain. So that could be on the sales side or the customer service side, where you've got massively parallel interactions if you in a B2C space. That's on the intake side, where you've got client onboarding, where you've got employee onboarding, where you've got procurement processes, so onboarding of suppliers, can largely be automated and strengthened by the use of agents across your supply chain, whether that's a physical supply chain in a manufacturing sense, working out driver schedules, working out production orders. All of these things that humans do in your organization can greatly be assisted with Agentic. And that's all the way through to where you invoice your clients, where you receive the money, allocate that, and reconcile what they pay versus what they owe you.
And going back to the unified cognitive kit, Mariti says, which parts of the unified cognitive kit do you find takes the longest to get right in real projects?
I want to get back to that in future, but I definitely think that it's the planning piece. So, you can't see the infinite number of options and possibilities that any agent can use to solve problems. And often, very interestingly, they come up with some of these approaches themselves. But through just as you get experience in the workplace, through working with more experienced people, you start to see how they plan around certain situations. You learn things and you pick up things and you become better at your job. So it's like also in your career, your reasoning would improve. I sincerely hope your perception doesn't improve because you should be reading quite well when you enter the workplace, but your planning really, really steps up a notch. And so that often people don't get right from the start, but it's also important to realize that that's an ongoing thing that you need to improve over time.
Carl Gounden says, interesting stuff, guys. Wanted to know if a company has already has RPA and RDP, how long does it typically take to move forward towards true agentic capability?
Okay, so it's a very difficult question to estimate without knowing the kind of complexity in the process that's going to be undertaken. But if there's a baseline of automation in place, these things are massively accelerated. And I'm talking about a number of weeks to like a few months. That's all obviously going to depend on the speed of the organization being able to adapt to these technologies, get it into their IT landscape, go through all of the right governance steps, CAB approvals, etc., etc. But the physical configuration, building, setting up, and refining of these things are a matter of weeks, not extended project timelines. And this is really critical because if it's not this way, you can't massively scale with agentic.
Akira says, you spoke about agentic AI being goal driven instead of task driven. What is the simplest real business process where people could expect to see this difference clearly?
Okay, and so again, it's really going to be dependent on where in a business you operate. If you in a kind of a sales role, it's very difficult to talk about back office accounting stuff in depth and the other way around. But as an example, when something is very, very process orientated, it follows a sequence of steps. And so if any one of those things are not in exactly the order that it's expecting, it creates essentially a business exception. And what you find is that there's exceptions in almost all processes. And so when you change that to execute sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you say achieve goal 1, 2, 3 within these constraints, you'll see these systems figuring things out. Simple examples are that our clients don't put the exact description on an invoice that we issue to them on a purchase order. They might not invoice the exact amount because there might be prices, overages, and underages. There might be a bunch of credit notes somewhere in the mix. And when you've got an agent that starts behaving like a real accountant, they would follow the same steps of checking credit notes, checking open items, seeing what the net position is, instead of just saying, I've got an invoice that doesn't match to a purchase order. So I'm going to give it back to human and have a business exception created essentially.
Yeah, that's really the difference. We have one last question here. If anyone wants to add any more questions, feel free. But Rio says, if someone wants to leave this session and take one practical next step tomorrow, what should that be?
So I think that leaving the session and getting into like real agentic going forward, firstly, subscribe to the webinar series because there's going to be a bunch of episodes this year that's really going to dive into different aspects of agentic, have a lot of interesting topics like the evolution of LLMs, where we've come from, where we are now. But I think the first thing is to start looking at your organization differently. People are not supposed to be dispensable. People are all supposed to be elevated in their job roles. And so when you go into your workplace tomorrow, look at what a colleague is doing, look at what you are doing, and ask yourself, is this something that is possibly uh, be able to be taken over by a agentic solution? And instead of saying and convincing yourself that this is really value adding and you moving the needle and you can never be replaced, rather embrace that and say, how would you model this on something like the UCK? And how would you frame this job that you're looking at to fit into an agentic solution?
Looks like we missed a question in the chat here from Gerard Duplessis. Accountability and governance. When an AI agent makes a decision, who's responsible if it's wrong? The developer, the business user, the organization, because it's a serious issue for compliance, audits, and legal exposure.
And this is a very, very interesting topic that goes around the agentic ecosystem. There's thought leaders that have whole think tanks just about accountability and ethics in the age of AI. Now, at the end of the day, when you've got an employee that goes rogue, at the end of the day, it's very easy to say that you hold this employee accountable and that you want to send this employee to jail. And this is fine, because this is a human and this is how we've made our entire construct. But I think, by that argument, you have to ask, how much blame do I apportion to this employee's parents for the way that they've raised this person? How much blame do I apportion to all of the managers that this employee has had before them that maybe taught them the bad behavior that led up to this point? So at the end of the day, uh, it's a really good and a very difficult question to answer. Who holds the accountability? Is it the creator of the LLM? Is it the company that went and implemented it there? Is it the creator of the system where the internal control failed? Is it the result of the internal audit department? But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing here is not to give any agentic solutions more leeway than you would any organization. And I think in a lot of places, internal controls fail, and you read about these cases where a person steals 300 million from a job over a period of multiple years. And yes, the person goes to jail, but that 300 million is still missing. And at the end of the day, if you want to go on a witch hunt of like how this agentic solution went rogue, you can probably point fingers, but that money or that customer reputation is still going to have gone down the drain. And so I think the choke point, the control point for this is somewhere else than necessarily debating specifically where that blame goes. If you structure that well enough, then I think at the end of the day, all of these systems will stop when they start acting rogue, and there will be things in place to monitor that. Great. Thank you very much, Seb. I guess those are all of the questions.
Looks like we have one last one before we wrap up. Terrell says, "What are the biggest red flags that that you can tell if a company is building demos instead of real agentic systems?"
It's an interesting one, but I think it's when you get these massive demos with a lot of bravado and a lot of like smoke and mirrors and show optics, and that ends up not going anywhere, ends up not combining, it ends up not going into production, and it ends up not building value on itself. And I think that the risk there is not necessarily the people that end up building those demos. I think the risk there is that people try to chew off too much at one go. So I think the messaging there is that pick a piece that you can nicely box up. This is the job role that I'm trying to automate. Really go for it, full hog, get that into production, get some learnings out of that, and then move on to the next thing. Don't look at your organization and say, I'm going full tilt agentic and we're firing everyone tomorrow and we're going to just build agents that's going to replace everything.
Thanks, Terrell. One last one from Anza here. He says, "Great insight so far. What's one indicator that tells you a process needs agentic AI and not just automation?"
Yeah, and I think to wrap up, and we really do have to wrap up, There's definitely still a place for traditional automation. And I would say if you can find a process that's got absolutely zero variation, as an example, you've got this very tedious sales report that you have to create for your manager, and you start with an extract from a system, and there's a fixed number of steps. You have to pivot the thing, then you have to subtotal something, then you have to copy one cell from another system, but there's no variation. Those things are never going to move. It's never going to be like a month where the data is swapped around or negative or anything in this nature. So if that is true for a process, traditional automation works. But the moment that you bring in messy inputs, the moment that you bring in any kind of decision making that needs to happen along the way, or any variability in how something can achieve an outcome or a goal, that's now where Agentic steps in.
Very insightful. Thanks, Fani and Anza. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming out again today, taking the time out. Hopefully you learned something new and got a few of your questions answered. We will be doing more of these, so hopefully see you again in the future. Fani, if you would like to say anything.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for joining. There's going to be lots more of these episodes and future episodes. This was a very introductory one. We're going to get our hands dirty. We're going to look at agentic solutions. We're going to debate a lot more of the difficult topics, look at basic processes, and see how you can get into your agentic journey in 2026. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.